Welcome to the Leesburg Public Library virtually. Today's Florida History Lecture is presented by Dr. James Clark. He is a senior lecturer in the University of Central Florida History Department. He has emerged as one of Florida's leading historians, noted for his books and research. He is the author of 9 books and the editor of a 3-volume anthology of Florida literature. Welcome, Dr. James Clark.
Thank you very much, Deb. Before we began, Deb and I were talking about a number of topics, including the varied patronage the Leesburg Library has. And I was thinking about this. I don't want to scare any of your visitors off, Deb, but over 100 years ago, Florida became worried about illegal immigration, people sneaking across the border and coming into Florida. And they were taking jobs of hardworking Floridians. The legislature became concerned and asked Washington to do something about this. And Washington said, oh, there's no problem. You're just making this up. Florida said, no, it's a crisis. It's a crisis. And so the Florida legislature on its own decided to act to stem this influx, this flood, if you will, of immigrants coming into the country. Florida, and this is to date, Florida is the only state that has done this. Florida passed a law to keep out Canadians. So, keep that in mind. If you're, if you're from Canada, be careful. That's a true story. The Canadians were coming in and taking dock worker jobs, which were some of the best paying in Florida, and the legislature reacted. I think passing a law against Canadians shows how different Florida is. We march to a different drummer in Florida. People don't realize how different Florida is. We are Spanish. The rest of the world is British. And so many of us come from somewhere else. And Deb mentioned, taking New York history back in the day. I took Maryland history. Some of you may have taken Pennsylvania or Illinois history, whatever. And you learned it from the British point of view. You learned all about Jamestown and the Pilgrims. And the fact is that Florida was well underway when the Jamestown settlers and the Pilgrims got here. The first book about Florida was published a century before the Pilgrims got here. So we have this rich heritage that people don't know about. For example, all of you read about the Jamestown settlers and that horrible first year when they were hungry and starving and how miserable they were. If they had sailed a few hundred miles to the south, they could have checked into a hotel in St. Augustine and ordered room service. That's how far along Florida was. One of the great Florida historians, the late Michael Gannon, once said that that by the time the Pilgrims and Jamestown settlers arrived, Florida was already undergoing urban renewal. They were tearing down buildings in St. Augustine to build bigger buildings. To give you an idea of how far back we go, there we go. This is a letter in Old Spanish. Nobody reads Old Spanish. It's a letter to the king about activities in St. Augustine. And if you look here in the little box here, you'll see the words, and they won't mean anything to you. But in Old Spanish, it says St. Patrick. And over 250 years before St. Patrick's Day parades in New York and Boston, St. Augustine was already celebrating St. Patrick's Day. They were firing cannons and getting drunk and everything else for St. Patrick's. People forget the first Christmas takes part in in Florida. The first Thanksgiving takes part not in New England, but in Florida. Um, I've mentioned this a number of times. People seem surprised. Some of you at Christmas may do something started over 400 years ago by the Spanish in St. Augustine at Christmas time. That is putting a single candle in each of the windows of your home. You see people do that all the time, not realizing it's a Spanish thing that the Spanish bring. This is one of the early maps of Florida, not real accurate. Cuba's pretty good because they had settled Cuba. What fascinates me are a couple things. One, the Appalachian Mountains. People don't realize that this area up to Washington, D.C. and over to the Mississippi River was part of Florida. What's now the whole Southeast was once part of Florida. The Spanish, it's the Spanish who named the Appalachian Mountains. They give the name Appalachian to the mountain range because they discovered it. The other mountain range, the Florida mountains, many of you go skiing, I think, in the Florida mountains, which kind of touch on Lake County here. The Florida mountains are the result of an assumption by the early Spanish that there must be gold and silver here. There'd been gold and silver everywhere, so there must be gold and silver in Florida. They would ask the Indians, where's the gold? And the Indians would say there is no gold, and the Spanish would kill them. So the Indians learned very quickly to say, oh, it's right up the road, you can't miss it. And the Spanish would say, thank you. And so for a number of years, the Spanish labored under the idea that there was a mountain range running down the middle of Florida. The maps get a little bigger. What's interesting is this is a British map, which claims, of course, that Florida was originally settled by the British. But over here, you see the word Florida. They recognize the claim as far west as the Mississippi. This is all Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, all considered originally part of Florida. Lake County, by the way, has been 4 counties. Originally, it was part of St. Johns County. Early Florida only had 2 counties. The peninsula was St. John's, with the county seat in St. Augustine. Western Florida was Pensacola, was the county seat, Escambia County. Then we became, all of Central Florida became Mosquito County, that includes what's now Lake County, Volusia, Brevard, Seminole, Osceola, and Orange counties were part of Mosquito. That name didn't exactly draw tourists, and so they changed it to Orange County, and then counties began to break off. In 1878, Lake County broke off. The last one was Seminole County, around 1912. This is one of the first maps, accurate maps of Florida. In the earlier map, you could see Lake Okeechobee was up here. Now it's in the right place. What's interesting is that this map is the work of 2 people who absolutely no one knows had anything to do with Florida, although they are extremely famous for other things. The person who ordered the map was the Secretary of War. Again, nobody remembers him, even though he was the first to really map and survey Florida. This had all been unknown territory until about 1840. But the Secretary of War was John Poinsett, who we know better as the ambassador to Mexico, who came back with a beautiful red plant and introduced the poinsettia, however you pronounce it, to the nation. The second one was the guy who actually did the surveying, who traveled all around Florida. An amazing thing was Robert E. Lee, who later becomes the commander of the Confederate armies. This is West Florida. I told you how big Florida was. This is Florida in 1810. I said I'd have some questions. I'm a teacher, so I have to give quizzes. Would anybody like to guess the biggest city in West Florida in 1810? Any ideas?
New Orleans?
No, New Orleans was still Spanish. It's Baton Rouge. Baton Rouge is part of Florida. In fact, if you go there, they call their counties parishes, of course, but they still call this area here the Florida parishes. Baton Rouge is in one of the Florida parishes. So this was all Florida. In 1810, there is a revolution, and the Spanish are overthrown by the Americans in Baton Rouge. And they're going to set up an independent government for all of West Florida, from the Apalachicola River here over to the Mississippi. The president of the United States says, "No, we're not starting any more countries here," and he orders them basically, "Hey, surrender to us, or we'll send troops down." And so they give up, and this becomes part of the United States. And then they give it away to Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana, so parts of Florida. People have been stealing from us for years. Georgia stole a big hunk of Florida. Anybody know what this is? Whose flag this is? No, it's not the Lone Star flag of Texas. It's the flag of West Florida. When they proclaim themselves an independent nation, they adopt this flag and use it for a few weeks while they are an independent nation. Texas will later steal it, and they're known as the Lone Star State. They also steal something else from us, a phrase that you've heard 1,000 times: "Don't mess with Texas." That's our phrase. It should be "Don't mess with Florida." And it comes from the Seminole Wars. Back in the 1830s, when the Seminole Wars began, the Seminole Indians would attack without warning. And our soldiers were used to, regiments lining up, shooting each other. And all of a sudden, these Indians are attacking at night and in the early morning. And so often soldiers, especially new ones, ran away. They deserted, just panicked. They had nowhere to go. And usually they got their nerve back and came back, and often turned out to be very good soldiers. But the generals needed to punish them. And how do you punish people in the middle of the swamp? And so their punishment would be to be shunned by their colleagues. And the way to do that was at mealtime, no one would eat with them. In the military, eating is known as mess. And so if a soldier was being shunned, the general would say, "Do not mess with him. Do not eat with him." The generals, especially Zachary Taylor, the commander in Florida, who becomes the commander in the Mexican-American War, remembers the punishment and does the same thing in Texas. And so Texas gets the cliche, "Don't mess with Texas." This is the final, the next to the last Confederate flag. The Confederacy kept changing flags. I don't know why, but they did. The problem with this flag was that when there was no wind, it hung like a white sheet. It looked like a surrender flag, and it caused a lot of confusion. So in literally the final weeks of the war, they put a red stripe down the side of the flag, so it wouldn't look like a surrender flag. So by now you're saying, what has that got to do with Florida? After the Civil War, a series of governors served in the war, knew about the Confederate problem with the flag, and looked at our flag, which was a small state symbol in a white field. And when it hung down, it looked like a big empty white sheet, especially in a city like Tallahassee, where there were a number of state flags. It looked like somebody was hanging out the laundry all over the city. So the solution to that was to add the big X that we all know on our flag. The big X symbolizes absolutely nothing. It's just there so it doesn't look like a big white sheet. Some people say, oh, it's left over from the Spanish era. The Spanish colonial flag had a big X. Some people say, no, they took the big X from the Confederate battle flag, but all it was to, so it wouldn't look like a sheet. My preference is Florida's first flag. I'd like for you to send me money to help my lobbying effort to bring back Florida's first flag. Now, is this a great flag or not? Wouldn't you love that? Leave us alone, you know? Wouldn't you like to have that outside your house, you know? Salesmen, people coming along, you know, tree trimmers, and you got this flag. Let us alone. So I'm hoping to bring this back, but this was the first flag, and our first governor said, you know, people might be offended by this, and so they dropped it and moved on to other flags. This is Chester A. Arthur, one of our forgotten presidents. You probably don't remember good old Chet Arthur. He becomes the first president to come to Florida. Think about that. We had been around, we'd been part of the United States for 60 years. No president had ever come here. And so Arthur comes here on a vacation, but also he's thinking about running for another term. He replaced Garfield when Garfield was assassinated. He's thinking about running for a term in his own right and wants to, you know, meet Florida Republicans. What's amazing, two things about his visit. One is that he comes down, he loves fishing. He's going to go fishing. And he and his party go to Kissimmee, Florida. You know where that is. And the president of the United States is told he cannot go south of Kissimmee, Florida. He is not allowed to go anywhere in the peninsula south of Kissimmee. And the reason is that even in 1883, there are no telegraph lines. Think about that. There are telegraph lines to California, but there are no telegraph lines in South Florida, and the president of the United States cannot be out of touch with Washington. So he's going to go fishing, and he's brought some aides and friends. And so they go to Kissimmee, and he hires a fishing guide, and he says to his friends, let's go. And they kind of hem and haw, and they say, well, we don't want to go fishing. And he said, what are you talking about? We came all this way to go fishing. And they say, well, you know, the people here kind of talked about something different that really sounds kind of exciting that we can't do up north. And he said, well, what are you talking about? He said, they've offered to take us out on Lake Toho and shoot alligators. And Arthur says, well, I'm going fishing. And they say, well, we're going to go shoot alligators. So he takes off and he asks the guide for a place to go. And the guide says, well, you know, there's a creek right up here, great fishing. And sure enough, Arthur has a fantastic time. He comes down after spending the day at this little creek and has a bunch of fish and pronounces it the greatest place on earth. What's amazing to me is that 80 years later, Walt Disney will come to that same little creek, Reedy Creek, and build Walt Disney World on the banks of Reedy Creek. It's the city is called Reedy Creek today. So here you have these two people 80 years apart seeing the wonders of this tiny, tiny creek. This is Harry Truman at Key West. He becomes our favorite president in the sense of coming here for vacations. Truman was perhaps the poorest president we've ever had and just didn't have any money. And, you know, today presidents rent estates and, you know, big houses for vacations. He didn't have that kind of money. And so one of his aides said, you know, if you go to Key West, the Navy will transport you there. There's a house the Navy owns you can have. They'll feed you. Basically, you get a free vacation. He fell in love with Key West, and he over the 8 years he served, he spent 8 months in Key West, 8 months. So that would be an average of a month a year, which is just amazing. While he was here, people kind of bent his ear, told him about problems in the Everglades. And the result was that he was the president who declared the Everglades National Park after hearing about issues in the Everglades. This is Richard Nixon with his best friend, Bibi Rebozo. Nixon, of course, from California, won the Senate race in 1950. And after winning, he came back to Washington. He was a congressman to do some paperwork and stuff. And he ran into his old friend, George Smathers, who had just been elected to the US Senate from Florida. And Nixon, of course, loved the sun. And he was complaining, excuse me, about the miserable weather in Washington. And he said, gosh, I'd love to get some sun. But back then, the old DC airplanes took forever to get to California. It was, you know, 8, 9, 10 hours. You had to change planes. And he said, once I get there, everybody wants me to make a speech or something. And Smathers said, well, listen, there are these new flights on national airlines, take you to Miami. You can be there in 3 hours or so and enjoy the sun. And I'll introduce you to a friend of mine. And the friend turns out to be his lifelong friend, Bibi Rebozo. And Nixon loves Key Biscayne. Fast forward to 1968, and Nixon is elected president. And there is a rumor that Nixon is going to appoint a Democrat to his cabinet. And the rumor keeps gaining steam and eventually becomes that he is going to appoint his good friend George Smathers as Attorney General. So sure enough, the phone call comes from an aide who says, Senator Smathers, President-elect Nixon would like to call you at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. And Smathers says, great, all right. So he gets the family together and they're all waiting for the big phone call. And sure enough, 10 o'clock, the phone rings and it's Nixon. And Nixon says, George, I want to ask you a favor. And George says, anything you want, Dick. And he says, no, let me tell you, no, you don't even have to say it. Whatever you want, you can have. And Nixon again tries. He says, wait, let me tell you what I'm after here. No, you don't even have to say it. Anything I can do for you, I'm ready to do. And Nixon says, well, okay, I want you to sell me your house in Key Biscayne. And Smathers, now in a trap, says, okay, it was going to be his retirement home. And it becomes the Key West White House, the Florida White House, that we know so well, where Nixon eventually built a compound of 3 houses, and he was there when he learned of the Watergate break-in. All right, students, who's this man? You all know this man. You give him money all the time.
No idea. Sorry.
You see him maybe once a week. You've been seeing him for years. Nobody? Right. It is George W. Jenkins, the founder of public supermarkets. And his portrait hangs in the customer service area of every Publix grocery store. I assume you've been to Publix, Deb?
Yeah.
George W. Jenkins is the founder of Publix. He comes here in the late 1920s. He's only 17 years old. He's dropped out of high school. And he's going to get into real estate. Everybody's making their fortune. He goes over to the St. Petersburg area, and he's going to be a binder boy, a term that no longer exists. You all know what an open house is, right? The realtor sits in the house for a few hours on Sunday afternoon. But most of the land in Florida that was being sold was empty. So these young boys would come into Florida, thousands of them, and take jobs as binder boys. And basically they would get a chair and they would sit on a piece of property that was for sale. And people would come by and they'd look at the piece of property, and the binder boy would say, "Oh, this is a great piece of property. Oh, you ought to buy it." And if they sold it, the people would give the binder boy a binder, a deposit. And the binder boy then would get a percentage of the sale. So that's what he's come to make his fortune. No sooner had he gotten here than the land boom collapses, just boom, falls apart. And he needs a job, and he gets a job at Piggly Wiggly. Again, the Florida legislature, gee, if you thought the Canadian legislation was crazy, this is the silliest one. There were thousands of these binder boys with no prospects for jobs, just, bumming off people, living on the dole. And the state wanted to get rid of them. And so the legislature passed a law, which people have come to call the dead body law. And it said that if you died in Florida and your body was shipped somewhere else, the coffin had to be accompanied by a live person. And so the binder boys who wanted to go home would go down to the train station and see if there were any coffins going to their hometown. And, hey, I got a coffin going to Cleveland. Oh, I want to go to Cleveland. And so they got rid of a lot of the binder boys this way. So he gets a job at a chain called Piggly Wiggly. Some of you remember. Piggly Wiggly's still around. And the chain is sold. And he has some ideas about how to make the store better. And here's this kid, he's, not even 20 yet, 21. And actually his ideas were brilliant. And at his own expense, he buys a train ticket, and goes up to Atlanta to talk to the new owner. The secretary blows him off, says, "Oh, he's very busy. He can't talk to you. He just bought all these new grocery stores. He doesn't have time." And Jenkins, okay, well, all right, I get that. And as he's walking out, he hears the guy on the phone making a golf date for that afternoon. And he says to himself, if this guy's playing golf after buying all these stores, I can beat him. And he goes back to Winter Haven and opens his own store. And he will credit a couple of things with his success. Piggly Wiggly was the first self-service grocery store, and they were worried that customers would take self-service too literally and become shoplifters. And so their stores look like a prison. There's inside the store, there's chain link fence everywhere. And you have to go through little turnstiles. The aisles are narrow, all designed to prevent people from stealing. His idea was to have open areas, wide aisles, things like that. And so he starts the public stores in Winter Haven. Later, his second idea that he credits with his success were electric doors. Today, you don't even pay attention to electric doors, but Jenkins was the first to introduce them in Florida. And those of us of a certain age, me, can remember the electric eye where you put your hand in front of it and the little beam of light and the doors would open. And these were a great toy when I was a kid. Hey, Mom, can I go to the grocery store with you to play with the electric eye? And so the kids would come, and those of you who remember shopping with your children, remember every 30 seconds they'd say, buy that for me, buy that for me. And so he credited the automatic doors with his success. This is some of you are familiar with this, some more familiar than others. This is the ABC Liquor Company. And I love this story. A man named Jack Holloway in 1936 opens a bar in downtown Orlando. And Prohibition had just ended just a few years before. And so he ran the liquor store for a while. I'm sorry, ran the bar, and then decided to open a liquor store. And he needed a name. And this is the brilliance, the most brilliant idea. And this is why ABC liquor stores are everywhere today. When Prohibition passed, many states in the North, and some of you may remember this, took over the sale of liquor. They opened their own liquor stores through the state. And in every state, it was known as the Alcohol Beverage Control Board. And the liquor stores, I remember in Maryland, there were some, Pennsylvania, were called ABC stores. And he named his company ABC Liquors. And what would happen, of course, people would move down here from Pennsylvania or New York or Michigan, and they'd say, where's the ABC store? So people would seek him out. He didn't have to advertise or anything. He had thousands of people every day moving here and saying, where's the ABC liquor store? This is a Spanish ship which runs itself aground in Palm Beach around 1880, and big case of insurance fraud. What is unusual about this ship is that it's coming from the Pacific Ocean, and it has on board 20,000 coconuts. Coconut palms are not indigenous to Florida. This is where they come from. When the ship hit the rocks and the shoals, it dumped 20,000 of these coconuts all along the shore of Lake Worth between Palm Beach and West Palm Beach. And those are the source of coconut palms. They're not indigenous to Florida. This is the beautiful Fontainebleau Motel or Hotel in Miami Beach, a magnificent structure. And it's undergoing construction in the 1950s. I pointed out because, as with all construction projects, they have to have a construction shack, a place to store their tools and the blueprints and stuff. This is their construction shack, which of course is the largest home in Florida. It is the mansion of Harvey Firestone, the tire king. And so he had sold his land there early on in Palm Beach. The people of Palm Beach were very snooty, and they didn't like the automobile people. They called them oil can society. So the oil people and the gas and the automobile people kind of stayed away. John D. Rockefeller built his home in Ormond Beach. Henry Ford built or bought a home in Fort Myers, and Harvey Firestone built a home in Miami Beach. And so once Palm Beach began to accept the automotive people, Harvey sold his land and moved to Palm Beach. This is the Breakers Hotel, the second one, burning to the ground. The Breakers Hotel that we know now is the third Breakers Hotel. The interesting thing to me is how it got its name and how Florida changed. Henry Flagler built most of his hotels inland. If you've ever been to St. Augustine, the Ponce de Leon is in the city. The Ormond Beach was away from the coast. His first one in Palm Beach was on the lakeside. It was kind of a low class thing to have a suntan. People took you for a worker, a laborer, a poor person. And that begins to change in the 1920s. So when he builds the breakers, the first one, it's way back, but it's the closer one to the ocean. People would call and they'd say, I'd like to make a reservation. Which hotel would you like? I want to be near the one closer to the breakers, closer to the waves, closer to the ocean. And so all of a sudden, the Flagler people, Flagler's dead by now, but realize, hey, the ocean is becoming the attraction here, and they will build the breakers hotels closer and closer to the ocean. This is the Quincy Coca-Cola Bottling Company, and doesn't look like much to you, but by golly, I wish I'd been there 140 years ago. There were no professional organizations to speak of in Florida. There weren't enough lawyers to have the Florida Bar Association. There weren't enough bankers to have the Florida Bankers Association. And so bankers in Florida tended to either join the Georgia Bankers Association or the Alabama Bankers Association. Quincy's right on the Georgia border. And the banker in Quincy went to the Georgia Bankers Association, and he met a man who was with a bank and who said that he was just getting ready to issue stock in a new company. And he convinced this conservative, staid, small town banker that this stock would be a good investment. And the banker went home and convinced his all his clients were tobacco farmers, convinced his tobacco farmers clients to buy stock. These people had never owned a share of stock in their lives, but they buy stock in this new company called CocaCola. They would become known as the Coca-Cola millionaires. And the stock owned by this handful of people in Quincy, Florida, eventually becomes worth $2 billion. Isn't that amazing? The banker, when he finished selling the stock, had a choice. Coca-Cola said, do you want your payment in stock or cash? The banker said, I'll take it in stock. His stock also became worth $2 billion. Fast forward 130 years, and the bank, now known as SunTrust, gets into trouble during the 2008 problems, and things are really rocky here. They are able to use what is now $2 billion in Coca-Cola stock to prop themselves up and survive. This is Fred Marriott racing on the beach. This is where the tradition of racing on the beach begins. He holds the world speed record for several years. This is a steam-powered car getting up to 127 miles an hour. And now we got all these cars on the beach, thanks to Fred Marriott and his friends. Automakers would come down here to test out their cars. Henry Ford came down. All these people would come down because they could go as fast as they wanted. It was a wide open beach, and they could really give their cars a test. Florida is the home of three airlines, National, Eastern, and Pan American. But it is also the home of the First Airline. This was an airline started by Tony Janus, carrying passengers in 1914 between St. Petersburg and Tampa. There was no bridge back then, and it literally was a day trip from St. Petersburg to Tampa. Tony Janus offered flights. He could only take one person at a time, but he offered a regular schedule. This becomes the nation's first airline. He only does it for a few months and then accepts a job offer from the Tsar of Russia to come over and train Russian pilots for World War I. He is killed in a crash there, but the airline industry's top award is still named for him, the Tony Janus Award, which is given every year to the person who does the most for the airline industry. This is Thomas Edison in Fort Myers. He built a home in Fort Myers. Early on, people thought bamboo might be the filament in the light bulb. It turned out to be carbon, but he experimented a lot with bamboo. And people told him there was a lot of bamboo in Fort Myers. So he went down to Fort Myers and built a home and carried out experiments. His friend Henry Ford bought the home next to him, and they were fast friends. I want you to look at this car and notice the wheels, that they are wide. They are much wider than normal. Henry Ford built this car especially for his friend Thomas Edison, with wider wheels to get around the muddy roads of Florida. And Ford and Edison get so bothered by the horrible roads that they come together and push for creation of what's now the Tamiami Trail, hooking up Tampa with Miami. Burt Reynolds, everybody knows Burt Reynolds, born in Georgia, but as a child, he moves here when his father is named the police chief of Riviera Beach on the coast, east coast of Florida. He wants to be a football player and he wants to be an NFL player. And so he goes to FSU, which is just beginning a football program. FSU had been the Florida Women's College, but now after World War II, it begins admitting men. He is going to be a good football player. Wow. He is a standout and his future looks bright. And then he bangs up his knee and his career in football comes to an end. The counselors at FSU, never quite sure how bright some of their football players were, advised him to take some easy courses, including a drama course. And after he banged up his knee, he told people he didn't know what he was going to do. But his drama teacher said, you know, you really have some talent. And he had never thought of just taking an easy A course. And the drama teacher gave him the name of somebody in New York and sent him on his way. And of course, he became a famous actor we know. All right, you did so badly on the last quizzes. Anybody want to try this guy? Any ideas who this guy is? You know who this guy is. No?
I read the book, but I can't say.
Walt Disney. This is Walt Disney with his mother. Very few people realize the connection Walt had with Florida. His family lived here in the late 1800s. To show you how small Lake County was, Lake County breaks off from Orange County in 1878, and it is months before they issue their first marriage license. There are so few people, nobody gets married in the first few months. They finally, Lake County issues its first marriage license, and it is issued to Walt Disney's parents. Both sets of his grandparents are living in North Lake County. There's still Disney family members around Paisley in North Lake County, around Astor. I have to be careful about this. People used to call them the have-not Disneys, which I'm not sure is, I don't think I'd want to be the have-not Clarks. But so he knew the area. He came down here as a child to visit his cousins. And so he knew Florida. And when it comes time to build an attraction, he's all set. He looks at a number of cities: St. Louis, Niagara Falls, outside Washington, D.C., outside New York, but eventually he rejects all of them and settles on Florida. He looks over at Bradenton and Daytona Beach, very familiar with Daytona Beach from his childhood, and rejects both of them because he doesn't want to, as he puts it, compete with a free attraction. By that, he means the beach. He doesn't want people saying, gee, should I spend $100 at Disney World today, or should I go to the beach for free? And he narrows it down to two places, Ocala and Orlando. He flies in to Tampa. He always was secretive, and drives up to Ocala and looks at sites there, finds a really good site. The next day, instead of driving to Orlando, he has to get back to California. So he flies over Orlando, and at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, he flies over the intersection of the Turnpike and the interstate. He points out the window and says, that's it. Certainly a historic day for Florida. 1 o'clock. Anybody remember what they were doing at 1 o'clock on that afternoon when Walt Disney picked Orlando for Disney World? Any guesses? Some of you are going to remember. The plane then banks. They have to go back to California. They stop in New Orleans to refuel, and Walt gets off to stretch his legs. And one of the ground crew comes up to him and says, Mr. Disney, did you hear that President Kennedy was shot at 1 o'clock this afternoon in Dallas? So a day that we think of changing the entire world is also the day that changes Florida forever, and will lead to his announcement with Governor Burns that Disney World is coming here. I mentioned this to show you how new Florida is. Of the 20 largest cities in the country, Miami is the newest, not until 1896. You think about it, there was a Los Angeles, a San Francisco, Honolulu, and there's nothing in Miami. This was the only business in Miami, a small grocery, grain and hay store in Miami. I always end with a story. It's a story, and you get to do lots of neat things. And one of the neatest things I got to do was an oral history with Ray Charles. And he had been born in North Florida, and just a tragic life. I didn't know a lot of it at the time. This was before his biography came out, and certainly before the movie. A few dollars worth of medical care would have taken care of his blindness. And in addition to that, the last thing he remembered seeing before going blind was as a toddler watching his brother drown in a wash tub. So this was tragic. His mother could not care for him and put him in the School for the Blind. In 1969, the School for the Deaf and the Blind were combined in St. Augustine, but back then there were separate schools for the deaf and the blind. You have to think about this for a minute, because first of all, it's outrageous, but it takes a second to think of. The School for the Blind under Florida law was segregated. Okay, blacks and whites could not get together in the School for the Blind. He said it was kind of like a pinball machine, being inside a pinball machine. He said the teachers would say, Ray, get away from that white boy. And he'd walk another way. Ray, get away from that white girl. And whichever way he turned, of course, he's blind. He doesn't know who he's near. And he had been thrown out of the school at the age of 15. And I didn't know the details. And I was afraid if I asked him kind of in sequence, he might get mad in the interview. And I said, I saved it to the end. And I said, a couple of things, Ray. I said, I kept asking about cities. And finally he said, I said, hey, do you remember playing in Jacksonville? Do you remember playing here? And I kept asking about Orlando. And finally he says, hey man, when you're blind, one city looks like another. So, but I asked him about his day, and he said he would get there early and ask somebody in the bar where he was playing, where the window was, and then ask the person to help him push the piano over by the window, and he would open the window. And I said, you're not supposed to interrupt during oral interviews, but gosh, I felt I was so smart, I knew the answer. And I said, because I thought those places got smoky. And he said, no, man, what are you talking about? I said, well, what'd you do? Open the window. He said, I was blind and these fights would break out. People would start throwing beer bottles and I'm sitting there at the piano. So when the fights broke out, I'd jump out the window. And so his manager interrupts and says, well, you never told me that story. Yeah, I did. No, you didn't. And they go back and forth. And I only had a limited amount of time to speak with him. And so I said, well, let me get back to my questions here. And he said, the manager said, no, hold on just a minute. And he kept going back and forth. And finally, the manager laughed and said, you can have all the time you want. This is the greatest story I've ever heard. And I thought it was a good story, but wasn't the greatest I ever heard. And so I kind of looked with a quizzical look, and the manager said, listen, I don't think you understand. 2 years ago, we played a command performance for Queen Elizabeth at Buckingham Palace. And when Ray walked in, he said, where's the window? In case the Queen started throwing beer bottles. That for 50 years, he wanted to know where the exit was in case the crowd got rowdy. But I said, Ray, what happened? 15 years old and you get thrown out. And he said, and he gritted his teeth, and he'd been friendly and kind and generous the whole time. And he gritted his teeth and he said, I wasn't going to learn to play the guitar. And I didn't understand that. And I said, well, you knew you wanted to be a musician. He said, I was only going to learn the piano. Whoa. And I said, well, gee, wouldn't it help if you could play more instruments and you're looking for a career as a musician? And he said, no, I was not going to learn to play the guitar. Whoa, so I didn't know what to say. I'd asked the question a couple of times. What I did not know was that it was the policy of the state of Florida to teach young, blind African-American boys to learn to play the guitar, to prepare them for a lifetime of begging on street corners. That was to be their fate. They would give them this guitar and they would spend the rest of their lives playing it on street corners begging. And once he told me that, I got it. And he ended with my favorite line. He says, you can't play piano on a street corner. And so it ended happily. Can I tell you all anything? Any stories you have? Any history you know that I don't know?
We're catching our breath right now, James.
Yeah, there'll be a quiz.
That was so good. There's a lot more in his book, I might add. Oh my goodness. I don't remember the Way Charles story. Did I miss it?
I think it was in there. I can't remember which one it was in. Yeah. He, by the way, if you've ever seen the movie Ray, it opens in Seattle, which is a bizarre story in itself. He was trying to make it in Orlando and couldn't. And he had a friend come over and he said, will you bring a gas station map of the United States? And the friend went to the gas station, got the map and spread it out. And Ray said, "What's the furthest city away from Orlando in the United States?" And the friend looked at the map and said, "I guess Seattle." And Ray went down and bought a bus ticket to Seattle. And that's how he ended up there. Anybody have thoughts or comments or anything?
Does the book about Paradise Park, which was the black person Silver Springs? Oh, does the book talk about Paradise Park, which was the black person Silver Springs?
No, that book does not. One of my other books does. You know, people don't realize that there were blacks only beaches, and Virginia Beach in South Florida. When Dr. King, after the Montgomery bus boycott, when he came here, he took his family to Virginia Beach near Miami, which was the blacks only beach. Bethune Beach in Volusia County was blacks only. American Beach up near Amelia Island was blacks only. And I don't understand this law, and I don't understand what the thinking was, but the Atlantic Ocean was segregated. And so if blacks went in the water, they were subject to arrest at white beaches. And so, especially in St. Augustine, you have all these pictures of demonstrators wading in the water and state troopers running out to arrest them and put them on handcuffs in the Atlantic Ocean. St. Augustine, there were demonstrations in a lot of these places. So, anything else I can tell you? Well,
What is Lake County most noted for in history-wise, in your opinion?
Gosh, I'm trying to think. I hate to say it, but probably Groveland is the most famous thing to happen in Lake County, and it's only been in recent years that this has come to the fore. About 20 years ago, I spoke at the high school up there, and I said, "You all learn about Groveland?" And no, they didn't teach Groveland. They didn't talk about Groveland. And it was, in fact, the woman who claimed she was attacked, Norma Pageant, when I was teaching about Groveland at UCF, this kid raised his hand, the student raised his hand and said, "Groveland, Florida?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Wait a minute, I grew up in Groveland. I never heard this." And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "You're sure?" And I said, "Yeah." It turned out he had gone to his senior prom with Norma Pageant's granddaughter.
Oh my word.
And nobody ever mentioned this had happened there. So, yeah.
Thank goodness for Gilbert King.
Yes, and others who brought it to the public's attention. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned some things. And I think the true test of a talk like this is how many of these stories you pass on to other people. So thank you very much for having me today.
Thank you so much. Fantastic.